The quick intro, everyone. If everybody doesn't know, this is John. He works currently at Bambi and is one of our most prolific speakers. We're always extremely grateful to have him speak for us. So he's going to give us a talk on a deep dive into slots, as it says right there. And I'll let John take it away.
Well, thanks. All right. So yeah, the talk today, deep dive into slots. And kind of going into some more like extensibility, code reusability patterns within Vue. So yeah, usual intro. I'm a principal front-end engineer at Bambi. Used to work for the Elizabeth Warren presidential campaign up until that ended in March. Before that, I was at Joy Mode, so I know Elvis. And before that, I was at an agency called Blue State, where I did a bunch of work for various nonprofits and political campaigns. And I was there for about 6.5, 7 years, and tried a whole bunch of different technologies and eventually came to Vue in the last couple of years of that. Yeah, if you want to find me, my GitHub's Jon Jandoc. I made a website recently because I was on a podcast and I knew that they were going to ask me how will you find me on the internet, and I don't like I hate Twitter and I don't do Facebook and all that. So I just made a website. It's actually built in Svelte, not Vue. And I have an ongoing joke about how Svelte is the next thing, and it kind of is. It's like a half joke, but anyways, I decided to actually try Svelte, so I built it in Svelte. And then yeah, you can find me on the various Slacks, Vue.js LA, and the JSLA Slack. All right, so talking about slots. A few months ago, we talked about Pollen, which is a component library that we built at Bambi, and had a final slide that had some tips and tricks. By the way, are we recording? Just want to make sure that should I back up? Here you go. So you're muted.
I'm speaking, but yes, I just realized I'm muted. Yes, it has been recording. I see a recording.
Oh, it has been recording.
It has been recording. Yes,
cool.
At least I see a recording button. I don't know if you guys see a recording thing somewhere, but
up left.
You do? Okay, good.
Okay, I don't know where that. Okay. Anyways, so I don't have to do that stuff again. All right. So, anyways, a few months ago, I gave a talk about building a component library. We call it Pollen. One of the tips and tricks I said was slots are awesome. Use them, and I kind of left it at that. But I wanted to go a little bit deeper because slots are awesome, and you should be using them a lot more than I generally see people using them. So what really basic, what is a slot? It is a place to put child components. If you are familiar with React, it's roughly the equivalent of children, being able to pass the prop children to a component, and it's one of the most important code reusability patterns that we have here. So if you're familiar with React, people have come in. If you're familiar with React, the code on the left is kind of how you might use children. So you've got your, where is my little pointer thingy? All right, yeah. So children. All right, so children, this prop is available to pretty much any component. You don't always have to use it, but it's an array of nodes, text nodes, and React components and HTML elements. You can drop children in, and it will just render whatever kind of child components you have. Similarly, in Vue, we have what are called slots. So you can create a slot that'll take whatever child components you put into something. So here I've built a blog post component. We're going to be using this blog post component a lot. It's just got an article with a header. It's got a title. It's got a date. It'll take a created at date, and it'll transform that into something that's readable. So we've got some formatted time, and then a slot. And the slot is where the content of the blog will go. So similarly here, we've got our title, formatted time, and then children, where all the stuff will go. All right. So how we use this within Vue. So we still have our same blog post component here. We would, in a parent component, we'd import our blog post, put that in here, and then we would put in child components of that blog post, and that these two sections will be dropped into where there is a slot. And that's it. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. That is all you need to know about slots. No, of course not. There's way more to talk about for slots, but like funny enough, that's like the extent to which I see people use it. And that's kind of why I thought this talk was important. There's like a lot more to slots and more ways to use them. So to kind of go into that, let's talk about the difference between props and slots. So they're both props and slots are ways to pass something from a parent to a child. Slots specifically are for passing components to child, from passing components from the parent component to the child component. Props are generally, they pass down basic data types like strings, numbers, objects, arrays. Although technically, since almost everything in JavaScript other than like numbers and booleans and strings are objects, you can pass pretty much anything you want, including components, as a prop. To go into that a little bit more, let's say you want to pass in a title that's more than just a string. You want to pass an HTML string, something like this. So hello world will div with a subtitle, right? This is a pretty, I'm sure you guys have done something like this in the past, something pretty common where you want to pass a string and then you're like, oh wait, but I want to bold that word or add a link to that word. A lot of times I'll see people do this, or you can do a like, you'll do an HTML string. The thing is, Vue doesn't really know that it's an, like it sees an HTML string and it's like, okay, well, I'm just going to render this, like escape it and render it as a text, not as an HTML node. So if you want to actually do something like that, you have to do a vHTML title. I try to avoid this. For one thing, it's vulnerable to XSS attacks. So somebody could put some malicious code in and then it would, could render on there. So definitely never use vHTML if you're using like user-generated content. You need some way to sanitize the content before you run it through vHTML. And if you use like the Vue linting recommendations, like their ESLint Vue recommended, they will pretty much warn against using vHTML. It's still useful, but I try to avoid it. If you're in React, they make it really apparent that you shouldn't be doing this. Like the React equivalent, you have to do this dangerously set inner HTML with like underscore HTML and then like nice. whatever you want to set. Like it's you read that and you're like, should I be doing this? And that's exactly what you should be asking yourself. Should I be doing this? So like that is one thing where I think actually React is doing a better job here of, yeah.
Is there any reason to ever use it in
Vue? Sure. You can use it if you have a trusted source for your HTML. Like say you're pulling content for a blog post from Contentful or some other headless CMS, some other CMS source that is not outside, but is a trusted source of content, and you need to render that HTML string in Vue, then you could use it. That would be a thing. But maybe there's another way. But like, this is really, you should be asking yourself, is this a good idea if you're going to be using vHTML? Anyways, so that, that is it's generally something to avoid. Something that's a little bit better in React, the usual pattern is to pass a component as a prop down. So if this is React code here, rather than pass a string, an HTML string, you'd actually make a mini component right here, right? So you've got this is a React fragment, hello world, we've got a little subtitle here, and we pass that new component that I just created as a prop for title. And then title is able to interpret both text nodes and components. So you can actually do this in Vue too, if Vue as well, if you want. You can, create a component on the fly. Like when you create components, you can just like make one, blog title template, and then make a template. And then you can pass that, via your template down. You can just like arbitrarily create a component in here. I think a lot of people also don't realize that you can do, like when you're creating components, you usually just like import and then plug it into components. But this is, if you think about what is a component, it's just an object. So that is essentially what you're doing here.
I didn't know we could do this.
Huh?
I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah. So like, and you know, what is a component? It's like a template or a render function. It needs either one of those at the very minimum, and that's what you get there. You can also, you know, if again, like components are just objects. So if you want, you could even create a computed property. Like here, I'm just taking a title and a subtitle data property, smushing them together and creating a new component with it, and then just passing that. So, you know, you could do that if you want. You can then use there's in Vue, there's a generic component for doing dynamic components. So you just use a component, and then anytime you use component, you need the special attribute is. So is takes either a string that is an HTML tag name like div, or an HTML element, or a component, and it will create a dynamic component based off of whatever you pass in as a prop for is. So, you know, that is a pretty powerful. I use component is like all the time. The tricky part here is that you only want to do that if your title, if the thing that you're using is actually an object, is actually a component. Otherwise, if it's just a string, you'd want to render it as, you know, like here. This looks kind of hacky and like kind of janky, and it kind of is, because like it's not really the Vue way. I've done like all of this stuff I've done in the past, and depending on the situation, maybe it's the right solution for you. So I'm not, you know, maybe use VHTML, maybe do this. There's different options there. So maybe it's right, but generally I find slots are that this is not the way. This is the way, slots. All right, so we already have a slot in place. The next thing to think about is using named slots and fallback content. So you can have any number of slots in a component. Unlike React, well, yeah, so React has children, that's kind of the default slot. You can pass any other number of components as props in React. In Vue, you can have any number of slots. You just need to name them something. So there's slot. The default slot is named default. You can then create any other slots that you want. Slot here, I'm going to say slot name equals title. And then I have inside of the slot some fallback content. So that's just my usual, the existing title. So fallback content exists as a fallback if you don't put anything in a slot. So you know, we can continue to use title as a string, as the prop title as a string if we don't put anything in a slot that is named title. If you want to put something in that slot, you would do something like this. So you would create a template within your component, so child of your, you know, whatever your component is, template, and then you can either do v-slot : name of your slot, ours is title, or you can do # title. So
That's cool. I didn't know about the pound.
Yeah, I actually didn't know that either. That is I learned that like 3 months ago. I was like, oh, never seen that before. That's cool. But yeah, you can do # as a shorthand of v-slot in the same way that : is a shorthand for v-bind, and @ is a shorthand for v-on. And then other.
That's cool. I just want to back up real quick on kind of the last slide, or the top part of this slide, that the word title in line 5 and the word title in line 6 are not related. I just want to make sure that there's no confusion.
I probably should rename it. Like, yeah.
That's okay. Anyway, you're naming a slot called title, which has nothing to do with a separate variable named title.
Exactly. In this case, title is a variable. This title is just a string. I could have called this anything. I could have called it title slot. That might be a little bit clearer. Would probably have been a better idea if I called it title slot.
Anyway,
so yeah, anything that's within this template title right here, so h1 and this subtitle div, this will replace the h1 that's in your title slot. Anything else that's kind of like a sibling to it that doesn't live here, this lorem ipsum is assumed to just go in the default slot. I'll just drop in there. All right.
Can you do that walkthrough again really slowly?
Sure.
So make sure everybody's following with their eyes so they really see what's happening.
All right. Yeah. So in implementation of our blog post, we're putting some content within template vslot title, an h1 and a div. So anything that's in this title slot will be dropped in here and replace the fallback content, this h1 here. So this is a way for us to get our title and our subtitle into this space without having to pass like an HTML string and use vHTML. This is a better way of replacing content dynamically. It's a lot more flexible. And then additionally, anything else, so that covers this block, right? Anything else that's in here, so this lorem ipsum dolor string, that will go into the default slot. Cool. All right, next up. So slots and slots. You can put slots in slots if you want to like override larger parts of your component. So here I've got a slot named title. Let's say I want to update just the title. I can use the title slot. But let's say I want to replace not just the title, but also this like publish date. I want to replace the whole thing, all the contents of header with maybe some big hero banner. Probably a common use case, right? Like you've got a title and a publish date, but sometimes they're like, we got this huge image that we want to drop in instead. So, okay, cool. If you put in some big hero banner, that replaces the content in template header. That replaces all this content, right? So I'm actually, now the title slot doesn't even exist. We just overwrite all of that. It's a nice big chunk of replacing entire sections of layout. This is pretty powerful. Like if you want to make a really reusable layout and not have to worry about a whole bunch of different props or different conditionals, like, you know, if there's a, you know, format, if there's a created at, or if there's like a override prop, then do this, otherwise do this. Like, no, you can just use a slot to just nuke an entire section, right? Like just override an entire section. Any questions on that? All right, cool. All right, yeah, Yodog, I heard you like slots. So I put slots in your slots so you can reuse components while you reuse components. Cool. All right, and then additionally, you can access the content of slots within a component using this $$ slots and then whatever the name of the slot is. This $$ slots is an object similar to this $refs. It'll give you access to, you know, this $$ slots.default is of course like this content, and it's probably going to be a bunch of v nodes or like, you know, an array of nodes. But you can also use the like check for the existence of content within a slot. So in this case, let's say I only want to render the header element, the containing header element, if there's something in there to show. Like, so there should be either a title or something in the title slot or something in the header slot. Otherwise, let's not even render the header element at all. So you can actually go and like do a conditional where you say, check, you know, is there anything in slots header, or is there anything in slots title, or is there a title? And then just like return a Boolean true false on that. And, you know, use that to actually know if there's anything in the slot to render. So pretty helpful there. All right, and then this was this is a cool thing I learned. Like I was just experimenting, like, is this possible? Can we do this? So dynamic slots. You can make any number of slots that you want because the slots are differentiated by a name. The name is just a string. You can have as many strings as you want. So you could conceivably, like, let's say in our blog post, we want to be able to display any number of subsections within that blog post. And then, like, you know, for the sake of like consistent formatting, I want to say like each section should have a header, a number, like we should number that header. So here I'm just saying like take the index, add 1, so it's like 1 dot section title. And then whatever the content of that section is will just drop into a slot. The slot will be named, actually this should be section.id. But you can, you know, since the name, you know, like you can vbind a name. It's just any other variable. So here, what that looks like, I'm saying I have a privacy section and a terms of service section. I've got an ID privacy and ID terms of service. So here, like that's our key is the ID. And then again, this should say section.id. But then I can just go here and say template, privacy, template terms of service, and I can put whatever content I want for the privacy and the terms of service in here. I just, since I have access to whatever IDs, you can do some fancy enum stuff or whatever you want to like share across these strings, but it's there. I had no idea. I was just experimenting. I'm like, what if I v-forward some templates, and it totally worked. So yeah, because again, it's just JavaScript. These are just strings. These are just, it's all stuff you can play around with. All right, now the good stuff. So using data in slots. All right, so slot scope. So slots have the same component scope as the rest of the template that is using that as the parent component that is using the child. So, even though
just to reiterate that, so you're saying you're in the parent, you've used a slot. Now essentially the stuff in this that came from the slot is the same scope as the parent.
the stuff that will be going into the child has the same scope as the parent. So in this case, we have subtitle that exists within the scope of our parent layout. Even though this string lorem ipsum is going to be a child of blog post, we still have access to this subtitle. However, lorem ipsum here doesn't have access to whatever's inside blog post, not by default at least. So if we wanted to do something like that, we'd have to use what are called scoped slots. All right, so what does that look like? Let's say that I actually want access to this, this formatted time. It's useful. I want to be able to show the formatted time. I'm passing from the parent, I'm passing a date object created at. The child is using that in a computed property to return just a readable readable string, formatted time. Now I want that formatted time to be available to my slots. So here you can actually v-bind whatever that property is on your slot. So here I'm doing it to both the header and to the default slot. Now in the parent, if I want access to that, I can actually go ahead and as an argument for the as a value for the vslot header and the vslot default, I have access to whatever props were passed to that slot. So this header
slot, did you call it? Did you use the word props, or are they actually props?
They are actually. Yeah, so this
did you just name the variable props?
Yeah, so whatever you v-bind on the slot, formatted time,
sure, is a prop.
Title, whatever, that is now available as a slot prop. So cool. Header slot prop, this is an object. This could be anything that anything that you've added on. This is essentially it's a sub prop object. So both of these have access to formatted time because I've put them in there, but the scopes of each of these are distinct, right? Because I could v-bind different stuff on these two slots. Maybe this doesn't get formatted time at all, or maybe this, I don't know, has access to header content or something. So these two are actually distinct, header slot props and default slot props. Any questions on that? This is where it starts to get this. Now we're entering intermediate territory.
The word header slot props, I get the template is called header.
Yeah.
That's
my arbitrary naming. You can name this whatever you want.
Oh, okay. So that's why it seemed like you were okay. It seemed like you had to have
so this is a new variable
that's
an object that you can call whatever you want.
Got it.
Oftentimes also, I won't even bother naming it. I'll just deconstruct the object. So like curly bracket, formatted time, close curly bracket.
Okay, that makes
just
more
to-
sense.
so I
Okay,
don't
that's
have-
why that's the part I thought maybe it was like somehow magically figuring out the
No,
word
yeah.
header.
This is
Header together with, and then you just the way that what you did was you took the word header and then slot props. I thought you had to use header slot props, but it could be anything.
yeah. No,
just
you
wanna
can
make
name
sure
it
that it
whatever
wasn't
you
like-
want. I should have called
Got
it foo or something less logical. But
That's fine. No, anyway. I just want to make sure I understood there. Okay, good. That's what I was asking.
yeah. So anyways, it essentially follows this kind of format, right? All right. For folks that are familiar with React, this is kind of like render props as a concept. If you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. All right, and then finally, yeah, wait, did I skip something? Yeah, I skipped something. Wait, no, I didn't. Huh, oops, okay. All right, sorry, this was out of order. All right, so a note on syntax here. So if you're only using the default slot and you're not using named slots, you can actually simplify things a lot here. So you can just do v slot and then it's implied default, and then you can do your slot props, and you can see I'm doing the deconstructed object version here. And you can do that. You cannot use the simplified syntax.
V slot is that's what you're using to get the data object that comes through the slot.
Yeah, this is
Okay.
In this case, it's short for v dash slot colon default.
Got it. But it is essentially what you're binding there to get the data that's going to come through the slot regardless. It's the
Default
prop
slot,
data.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can't do so. Yeah. If you see this, that's what's happening here. You can't do the simplified v slot and mix it with named slots, because now you're starting to create some confusion, ambiguity over what slot has access to what. Like if you were to do that here, because the parent blog post has these default slot props, you'd think that default slot props would work in here, but they don't, because they're different slots that are actually like siblings and not parents. So a little confusing, but that is something to note. Thankfully, you'll see there's a little red squiggly here. Your linter, if you're using Vue linting, it'll tell you that you can't do this, and that's the reason why, because default slot props will not work inside of your header slot. Cool. Any questions there? All right. Let me back up, because now make sure. All right. Now, so that was intermediate class. This is now advanced class. This is one of my favorite things talk about. So let's talk about renderless components. Components that use slots and that scope slot to pass information to children, but not have any template whatsoever. They just return the children. So
Wait. Can you say that whole?
Yeah. All right. So this is a component that doesn't actually render anything itself. All it does is create a slot and pass information via slot props to that slot. But it itself doesn't render anything. Why is that useful? This is one of the most common use cases. This is one of the coolest use cases I've seen. All right. So let's say I've created a component. I'm calling it with content. Anytime that I do renderless components like this, I usually name them with something. So in this case, I'm calling it with content. As a prop, my component is going to take a request URL. And then what it's ultimately wants to do, it's going to handle error states, loading states to get and fetching content from that request URL and then passing it down to a child. And that, regardless of however you want to render that content, doesn't matter. This is really just, I'm encapsulating fetching content, loading state error, and any error messages, and passing that to the child. So here, I've got a request URL. I've got content, no content at first, is loading, I'm setting to true initially, and then no error messages initially. All right, and then I set up a watcher that watches the request URL. If the request URL changes, then I have a handler to handle that. What's it going to do? So we'll take the new value of request URL. We're going to say we're starting to load. This is loading as true. And then I'm going to, this, you know, I'm using Axios as an example here, however you're fetching data asynchronously, right? I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to get data from that. I'm going to, if it's successful, then cool, let's make sure we null out the error messages, and then we set the content data. If there's an error, we'll set the error message, and then finally, we're done loading defaults. All right, and so, yeah, that's pretty understandable logic here. What's different, you'll notice we're not using any templates. We just have a render function because there's nothing, you know, to render. Templates are fancy syntax for render functions in Vue. But what are we going to do that? So we're going to take the content, loading state, error messages, and we're going to actually pass those props to our default slot right here, this.slots default. Everybody following so far on that?
What's that immediate?
Sorry? Oh, yeah, immediate true. Yeah, so with a watcher, with watchers, you can either write, like, I could write request URL and then like new val and have this just be a function, or you could have it be an object with a handler property and an immediate property. And immediate says, as soon as this component is created, run the watcher. Whereas if you don't do immediate, it'll only run the watcher if it changes from its initial state. Yeah. Cool. Any questions? All right. So what does this look like in use? Here I'm taking my with content. I'm passing a request URL. You know, this is probably a pretty common pattern. I want to access my API blog and then some slug. Here I'm just assuming you have React router. We'll access route param slug on that. And then I've got my v slot that is being passed content is loading an error. And then I can go ahead and import other things like a loading spinner right here if it's loading. Otherwise, if there's an error message, I'll show the error message. Otherwise, I'll show my blog post. And you know, like, assume I have some helper function that's like takes the content and turns it into HTML or components or something. So I can put that in here. But you know, you can see that like this is almost purely layout. And I don't have to do anything about logic, right? Like I have removed the logic, and like I can reuse with content like I can wrap with content around any number of things. Doesn't really matter because it only cares about like, give me a request URL, here's the content. So really awesome code reusability pattern. Use this a ton at joy mode. Really useful. I don't know with Vue 3 if this will still be relevant, if composition API will take over this, but maybe it will, maybe it won't. Hooks have like this is essentially a higher order component is the closest equivalent in React of what this is, but and I use higher order components a lot less in React now. I use almost exclusively hooks, so that might be the same thing with Vue 3. Who knows? We'll see. Yeah, so that is that.
So may I just reiterate what I think I understood you just did like in that whole last section and see if it was correct, and maybe a couple of people with what it was. So if I may, imagine that you had a component that had, let's say, a blog post and 3 comments to it, right? And that same component would also do a GET request to get that data and possibly have some erroring that, like, you know, oh, I didn't get the data, so you're going to give some sort of error, right? Basically, the concept that Jon's describing here is to separate the display of that blog post with the 3 comments separate from, let's say, the GET request and the errors. So you would have, call it a parent component whose whole job it is to just do GET requests and then, you know, display errors for us. Oh, we couldn't hit the server, yada, yada. And then kind of in the middle of there where usually would have all the display stuff of like display the blog post and the 3 comments, that would have the word slot. And that would actually refer to another component that literally all it does is have a blog post and the 3 comments. So you basically have you have like all of this like fancy logic doing GET requests and errors, etc.
in a component, and the section where you may have laid out stuff visually, you kind of have that as like a child component you're now currently calling slots. Okay, and you just refer to that component. So then if you get the GET request, if you actually get your data, you passing all of that information to this other component that all it does is display. Is that?
Yeah, that's,
Sean,
I mean,
do I get
that's
the thumbs up? Is that-
the general idea here, like a good architecture is separate out concerns. And so some components are just for showing things and some components are for getting things.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not like, again, maybe it's not components, maybe you'll use a view composition API, or maybe you'll use the store or something, but like the more that you can like separate out components that are just purely presentational, that makes that super reusable. And then the more you can separate out components that are just purely data fetching, that makes those super reusable. It's when you have components that do both of those things where you end up like not making reusable components, because you're like, well, you know, I need a blog post with comments, but I also need a blog post without comments, but I also need like a home page, and I also need like a photo gallery. Like, what's the difference between a photo gallery and a blog post? Like, they both get data, so you could, with content, you could have some kind of content getting renderless component and share that logic, and then however you display it, that's a different component. That's a different, you know, that's a different presentational component to deal with that. So, you know, that is definitely like one of the big takeaways is thinking about separating out those concerns and making things more reusable.
It's a great organizational pattern. Thank you. Yeah.
Cool. All right. So yeah, key concepts. So things that we talked about: slots versus props, when to use one or the other, defaulted name slots, fallback content, dynamic components, dynamically named slots, accessing the content of slots in the context of a component, slot scope, and renderless components. I don't know if there's anything else more in, like, if there's too much more else to know about slots, but this'll get you pretty far if you can use all of these concepts. All right, and so yeah, thanks for listening. Are there any questions?
I have like two questions. First question is, I think I saw in a couple of screenshots when declaring slots on the parent component, you always create a template and you have the slot name on the template. I think there was one case on the blog post, maybe because it was default, that instead of having so like the slot name was directly on the component. Can you do that for other components?
Wait, so we're talking about
We can't see
like
your
this
screen.
guy?
I can
Show the screen again, John.
Am I not sharing screen? Let me show you. Oh, I forgot to actually hit the share button. There we go. All right, so like you're talking about, oops. Like this guy right here?
Yeah, and then if you see also on the second screenshot how the
Like
some
this.
big hero banner is within a template, and I'm assuming because there's two elements, but is it just possible to directly on some big hero banner have
Like if this were a div instead, like if the child element of the header slot was a div, I'm at this point, I think you need to use template.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you have
Yeah.
to do that. You
Yeah.
have to use
Got it.
I think that also might have changed around Vue 2.6. Like this, if you're working on an older code base, just heads up, the syntax changed a little bit at Vue 2.6 because scoped slots and normal slots were different things, and now at Vue 2.6 they simplified them so that they are the same thing.
God, and then just one more other question. It's like for renderless components, aside from like cleanliness and I guess like for the reusability factor, what are like some of the more, what are some other benefits you get out of using renderless components?
Yeah, I mean the code reusability is the big thing. Other things you could do like I've seen mouse tracking as an example. So like maybe or like scroll positions, like a waypoints replacement. don't know if you guys remember waypoints, but that was like, or like let's say you're scrolling down a page and you want something to happen at a certain point. Like a lot of the logic around, setting up scrolling listeners and all that can probably be encapsulated. So any kind of like, any like setup teardown logic that you find yourself repeating, maybe you can possibly pull that out and move that to a renderless component, like any kind of like anything related to that lifecycle stuff. Cool.
Other questions, anyone?
I just want to say one other thing. So with this, the with content renderless component that you've created, so in a perfect ideal world, for every kind of like page that makes a GET request, you'd want that to be like the higher order component. Like, would you want that to be the top level? Would you want this with content component in every page? That makes sense.
Maybe it kind of depends on like the situation. Like it, when I've used it at like in the past with joy mode, there were different sections of a page that had like this. I actually made a bunch of different, like, this is with content here is a very general, just give me a URL and I will go get content. I made up for the use case of joy mode, I had a bunch of different ones that are like, give me an ID for a specific data type and I will I'll do whatever needs to happen there. And maybe there's some transformations that need to happen that are specific to like that data type, like a bundle or an item or a user, like with user will give you information for a user given a user ID, right? Something like that. So maybe there's different examples that you could make out of this. It's one of those like, if I was doing something on every page like this, maybe I'd find a different reuse pattern. What is also useful here is like this doesn't have to be your entire page. Like there could be like sibling content and like maybe you have a blog post here and like a photo gallery and you've got two different with contents that are like next to each other. And like you're encapsulating the logic around each and then just passing down the content to the child. Cool. Yeah. All right.
Cool. Any other thoughts, anyone? Anybody have any thoughts on how they could see themselves possibly using this?
I will say, like, have used renderless components like all the time. Once you actually begin to see how useful it is a really, really useful pattern. So
I have not used renderless components before, but I have used slots pretty extensively. I had a component that would handle big data scrolling. So we had like a list of, I don't know, anywhere between 10 and a million things in a list, like a speech to text transcript, for example. The speech to text was editable, so you could edit each individual little piece. So we had a speech to text item component that would handle the functionality of editing itself. Essentially, it contained the logic for, clicking on the icon, focusing on the text, being able to change the text, save it, cancel it, whatever. And then it was put into a slot, which was the big data scroller slot. And that would manage the scroll position, which items to render. It would only render, it would do an approximation of the height of the slot components that were posted in, and create a scroll bar. So you could actually use your mouse wheel or an actual real scroll bar that was rendered in the browser to scroll through millions of items, essentially. And the logic to do the editing was contained within the subcomponents themselves. because we had speech to text, we had tags, we had descriptions, like a bunch of different little individual items that had their own logic, but we all wanted them to be able to have this big data scrolling functionality. So the big data scroller was sort of that renderless component. It wasn't exactly renderless because it did have some DOM in it, but that would be used to do all the scrolling logic and the mouse logic, kind of like you talked about waypoints and tracking mouse and things like that. It had a lot of that kind of responsibility, window resizing, things like that. But it was abstract enough and generic enough to be able to accept child components of different types that had their own logic and be able to handle various scenarios.
Yeah, and that's nice because then you're like your speech to text component can exist outside of the infinite scrolling context. Like that again, like makes it more reusable there. Where like maybe you just want that little piece. You don't need the whole thing. Because otherwise,
Yeah,
like it would be props drilling or something. Like you just like parent does everything and like on. It's kind of what happens in vanilla reactive. Like it on speech to text would be a prop for an event handler that you like drill down or something like that. Yeah.
I tended to use mine for something a lot simpler, which was just I was not using a CSS framework, and so in my app, I was using it basically like for modals. So I just had like a default looking like this is what my modal looks like. It takes a certain amount of, I mean, every modal is roughly the same, right? Like there's a pop-up message and maybe an okay or accept, whatever. I mean, or cancel kind of button or two. And I just reused that over and over again as, you know, that's kind of my use case for the slots. Anyway, just as an example, I don't know if that's suggested or not. I really like the concept that you're describing here, but anyway, for me, that was useful. And wasn't there something good?
Yeah, it's funny we are taking this great deep dive into the slots because I knew about slots a little bit and like I played around a little bit with it within some of the components I've worked in, but like at a very small like data level, maybe like a little block level stuff. But today I was able to take a component from like another coworker who made something really intricate and really complex and added like one slot area in it, one slot property. And then that was handed over to me and I was like able to take one of my components that I built and import it into that component and inject it into the slot there to like get it to work with all of his crazy logic that was going on. And I literally just like pretty much injected just my component and made it fit on the screen. And then all the scrolling magic and fancy bells and whistles, it literally just started working. And it was pretty sweet how it all came together.
Nice.
Yeah, it really makes your life so much easier and realize that you can reach for that. Because like oftentimes people are like, oh, let me just make another prop. And then I need to like, you know, do all these conditionals or whatever. Like if this prop exists and I want to render these elements, and like, no, you can just don't overthink it. Just put a slot there and then people can put whatever they want inside.
Really fascinating, really cool approach to handing anybody a little bit of code to like repurpose.
I can kind of see us using it in our code. We have a Rails app that we basically have two different apps on one app, just pulling from different metadata and different CSS. And we're using this gem called flip flop. So if we want it to be one application, we do this one thing. We say we call the gem like if Sinai whatever do this part, and so I could see using the slots in that way, like checking the URL to see if it's that particular, if it's the Sinai or the Ursus app. Curious if that would work in that way. Maybe.
I think so. I think also that another way to think of, if I'm understanding what you're describing, is also a dynamic component. So basically, like you know,
if you get this data source, you want it to look like this. If another data source, you want to look like that. So it's like basically use this component or this component, which is in my mind different than than slots, which is basically rendering, render this section versus this section. So instead of like having the entire component being rendered where you're kind of saying like display it this way or display it this way, I would think of it as render this component when it's this data or this component when it's this data, because they're just going to be, the whole thing is going to be look different, is my impression from what you
No,
just
actually,
said.
no, that's the same exact thing, really. It would be pretty much the same component. It's just different styling often.
Oh, okay. Cool.